In Paris in 2015, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, warned that the clock is ticking towards climate catastrophe. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has issued several reports over the years, the latest being a special report in 2018. Special Report 15, released in 2018, says, and I paraphrase, 1. The Earth has warmed by 1 degree centigrade since 1850. 2. Warming is anthropogenic, that is, human-caused. Specifically, it has been caused by emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This has been through burning fossil fuels like coal, petroleum, and natural gas. 3. The Earth will warm by a further half a degree as early as 2030 and may warm by a further 3 degrees by the end of the century. 4. To prevent this, we must limit carbon dioxide emissions by levelling off from 2020 and reaching net zero emissions by 2055 at the latest. So what is carbon dioxide, and is it dangerous? Carbon dioxide, which has the chemical formula CO2, is a gas which exists in air. Plants absorb CO2 and water vapour, with chemical formula H2O, to create plant materials like wood. The plant material either decays or we burn it, thereby releasing carbon dioxide and water vapour back into the air, so there is a natural balance. However, hundreds of millions of years ago, a huge amount of plant material became locked in the Earth's crust in the form of fossil fuels. By burning fossil fuels, we put extra carbon dioxide into the air. Before industrialization, carbon dioxide amounted to about 300 parts per million of the atmosphere. Now the level is about 400 parts per million. Carbon dioxide is a non-toxic plant food. People who grow vegetables in plastic tunnels pump carbon dioxide into them to improve plant growth. There is evidence that the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has improved crop growing and contributed to global greening, particularly in arid regions. If the level drops below 150 parts per million, the plants die and therefore animals die and we all die. But carbon dioxide also causes temperature to rise. By how much and what can we do about it? These are the questions. Without an atmosphere, the Earth would be a lot colder than it is. Specifically, water vapour and smaller quantities of other gases like carbon dioxide and methane provide a greenhouse effect, which is why these are called greenhouse gases. Heat emanating from the sun strikes the Earth. Some is reflected back into space by clouds, and some is radiated back into space overnight. But some of this radiation is trapped by water vapour, which acts as a form of blanket, keeping the Earth a lot warmer than it would otherwise be. So the water vapour in the atmosphere plays a part in this greenhouse effect. Indeed, it is the largest greenhouse gas component by far. Carbon dioxide also plays a part in the greenhouse gas effect, as does methane. The warnings by the IPCC have been amplified by the media. The media loves stories of imminent doom. So how much of this is true? We shall investigate some of the alarmists' claims and the history of alarmism. Then we will look at what the science says. Finally, we will look into possible future scenarios. We hear the claim that it is hotter now than it has ever been since temperature recording began. That is little over 150 years. However, history tells us that the Vikings colonized Greenland during what is known as the medieval warm period, from 950 AD to 1300 AD. The colonists lived off agriculture and even had their own bishop. In the same period, vineyards were established as far north as 53 degrees north in England. The quality of the wine must have been satisfactory, as French wine producers attempted to forbid wine production in England at that time. Much of what we know about the medieval warm period is from historical records, because of course there were no thermometers then. The medieval warm period is not the only warm period in the past. There is also evidence of the Roman warm period, and we can go further back. In his History of Britain, the well-known historian Simon Skarmer takes us to Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. A Stone Age civilization flourished there around 3000 BC. He informs us that it was warmer then, and the inhabitants' diet included red bream, mussels and oysters. There were also colder periods. One period was called the Little Ice Age. From the BBC we read, between 1309 and 1814 the Thames froze at least 23 times, and on 5 of these occasions, 1683 to 84, 1716, 1739 to 40, 1789 and 1814, the ice was thick enough to hold a fair. Evidence of past warm and cool periods is presented in thousands of papers and historical accounts, so it is a little surprising that the IPCC has largely ignored them. Here is a representation from ice core data from the Crete site in central Greenland. We see the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, as well as the Roman warm period. Skara Brae settlement fits into the period between 2000 and 3000 BC. It does suggest that the current warming is not unprecedented. It could be argued that the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age were local events in northern Europe. This is contradicted by studies from Australia and New Zealand, including a 1979 study from the Nelson region shown here. This cannot be a partisan view as it predates the current debate. One of the enduring predictions has been that Arctic sea ice would soon disappear, leaving open sea. In the 1920s, then the 1940s, then by James Hansen in 1988, and then by Al Gore in 2006, this claim has been made. It was supposed to have disappeared by 2012, then 2014, then 2018, and now it has been pushed back to 2030. Each prediction has proved false, and each time the ice has bounced back. Loss of Arctic sea ice is not new. Professor Jan Erik Solheim gave a talk in 2016 regarding the extent of historical Arctic sea ice as recorded in whaling logbooks. Whaling took place in Svalbard off the northern coast of Greenland. One can see that the least maximum extent was in 1769, and greatest extent was in 1866. We compare this with the Arctic sea ice maximum in 2018. Note the similarity with 1769. Of course, 1769 was well before industrialization, so CO2 could not be blamed. Professor Solheim suggests that the Arctic is beginning to cool. The report from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, NSIDC, for November 2018 says, quote, Arctic sea ice is 1.14 million square kilometers above the record November low in 2016, end quote. In fact, the record low is only since 1981, when Arctic sea ice was at a recent maximum. It appears to be bouncing back again. What about Antarctic sea ice? From the NASA website dated September 19th, 2014, we read, quote, sea ice surrounding Antarctica reached a new record high extent this year, covering more of the southern oceans than it has since scientists began a long-term satellite record to map sea ice extent in the late 1970s, end quote. A New Zealand scientific expedition from Otago bored a hole through the Ross ice sheet to the water below. They were surprised to find freezing ice, not melting as expected. This suggests that the ice sheet is stable. This was reported in Popular Mechanics on the 24th of February 2018. The media ascribe every major weather event to global warming. However, this chart by NOAA, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, shows a record of severe tornadoes in the United States. We see there is no discernible trend except for a possible decline. Dr. Ryan Maui presents this chart of global cyclone and hurricane energy over several decades. The top line shows total energy while the bottom line shows Northern Hemisphere energy. The shaded area therefore represents Southern Hemisphere energy. Again, there is no discernible trend. This chart by NOAA shows wet and dry periods in the United States. Again, there is no discernible trend for floods and droughts. Finally, regarding extreme weather, the IPCC itself acknowledges that the warming so far has not contributed to extreme weather. What about those tragic California fires we've been seeing? We look at a chart published by the Royal Society, Global Trends in Wildfire and its Impacts. Up until 2013, we see a decreasing trend in US wildfires, but an increase in the area burned. We also see an increase, inflation adjusted, in the cost of suppression. However, this chart from the US National Interagency Fire Center shows that burn average in the 1930s was far higher than it has been lately. 90% of fires are caused by humans rather than nature, for example lightning. Are there now more people living in close proximity to forests? NASA provides data showing sea levels have risen 120 meters over the last 20,000 years and 40 meters since the last ice age. The rate of rise is currently diminishing. Over the 20th century, sea levels rose by between 1 and 2 centimeters per decade, and there has been no acceleration since then. Yet Al Gore suggested catastrophic sea level rises. Recently, the news showed pictures of flooding in Venice and Florida, accompanied by dire warnings for the future. What they didn't tell us was that Venice is sinking because aquifers below the city have been drained, causing the land to subside. Florida is sinking slowly and Alaska is rising because of continental tilt, occurring since the last ice age. This is not due to global warming. Melting sea ice presents no problem to sea levels because ice is less dense than water, so melting does not raise sea levels. The land masses of Greenland and Antarctica are a different issue. Severe melting would certainly raise sea levels. So how are they looking? For Greenland, the NSIDC reports a small gain in ice, a sharp contrast with the preceding decade. On the other hand, NASA has been reporting growing ice volumes in Antarctica for some years. Ironically, this increased ice will eventually manifest itself in a greater flow of glaciers into the ocean, triggering more unfounded alarmist predictions. Be that as it may, sea levels have not risen unduly, which suggests that land ice is being conserved. Also, the possibility that Antarctica and Greenland will suddenly melt when they have been stable for the last 10 million years at least, is similar to the possibility that we will be struck by an asteroid. It could happen, but there is nothing to suggest it. When you hear about ocean acidification, it is important to put things in perspective. The oceans contain 1.33 billion cubic kilometers of seawater. According to the IPCC, humans have put 2,000 billion metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere since the start of industrialization. If all of that went into the oceans, it amounts to 2,000 tons per 1.33 cubic kilometers of ocean, or roughly 1.5 grams per ton of ocean. The ocean is in fact alkaline. This small amount of carbon cannot turn it acidic or even significantly less alkaline. Of course, in some local areas, runoff of pollutants can damage coral, but that is a different matter. That concludes the first part of the series. In the second part we'll be looking at what the science says about global warming.